Fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, I hope to show you the foundation for getting started with PASCO Capstone, our software for data analysis and collection in the upper secondary college level. So more on that in a moment. All right. So I'm going to show you three demonstrations today, and I hope through these three demonstrations to show you that foundation of skills for connecting sensors, collecting data from sensors, and doing analysis with those. So we're going to go pretty deep today, even though it's getting started. But even in this first activity, a mass on a spring, you're going to learn most of what you need to know about using Capstone across many experiments. After that, I'm going to demonstrate an impulse and momentum lab where we can dive a little bit deeper into analysis and learn how to get data out of Capstone for use in other programs as well. And then we'll end with a wireless sensor measurement of pressure versus volume, kind of gathering data in a different way from the first two activities. So I hope this will prove valuable to you. As I mentioned to those of you who joined us early, your mic is disabled. You can adjust your speaker so you can hear me well. And my colleague Jonathan and I may be speaking throughout this, but your mic is disabled. However, we do encourage your participation through a couple of tools here in our Zoom webinar tool. One of those is the Q&A panel. Now, your screen may look a little bit different depending on what platform you're on, but somewhere there should be a little toolbar. And if I zoom into that, you can see there are some buttons here that allow you to have some controls over what you're seeing besides my shared screen and video. One of those is the Q&A button. And if you open up Q&A, you're going to see it's basically a queue of questions. And my colleague Jonathan is going to be monitoring that throughout and answering some of the questions directly there in Q&A and feeding others to me to answer to all of you if they might be of general interest. Also available in that lower panel is a chat. And the chat's great for just making comments, answering questions if I ask you how things are going. One important thing about the chat panel there is you can choose to whom you're directing the message. It might be to just the panelists, it might be to panelists and all attendees. Depending on your platform, what version of Zoom you're running, it may instead say host and panelists versus everyone. But if you're comfortable with it, we invite you to pop open the chat window there and send a message to everyone letting us know where you're calling in from today. We already learned we have folks from Peru and in Greece and Germany. So let us know where you're joining us today, wherever it is in the world or North America. Hey, Jonathan. Jonathan and I are here in Roseville, California at PASCO headquarters, Montreal. Welcome, Marie. France, Antwerp, Belgium. Wow. South Africa, the UK. Wow, great representation across the world. We thank you for joining us. Boston, Vancouver Island, Arizona, Bonn, Germany, Copenhagen, Denmark, Switzerland, Portugal, Miami. Fantastic. Well, wherever you're joining us from, Texas, New York, we thank you for taking the time to join us today and learn something about Capstone, and especially for those of you who are at different time zones. So, Chile, Greece, Texas, New Jersey, Kentucky. Fantastic. So keep going in the chat as you have comments and that Q&A panel for the questions as they come. Granite Bay, welcome, just miles away. All right. So if you have trouble understanding, I'm going to go fairly fast today. But one thing that can help is that you can press the live transcript button and choose to show subtitles. And this is just machine translation, but it's amazing how good that is getting these days. So if you wish to see live captions of what I'm saying, click on live transcript there and choose show subtitle. It will pop up a little subtitle as if it's in the movies. And again, it's not going to be perfect because it is just live machine translation, but it may be helpful. Finally, if you're joining us live and not just watching the recording, you'll see that at times, including now, I have a live view along with a shared slide or screen, and you have control in this live session over what fraction of your screen is occupied by each of these things. So if you wanted to see a detail of the live video, you're welcome to grab a handle between those two sections, move it over, and you'll see the live action much bigger. Not so useful when you're seeing me, but perhaps useful when we switch over to equipment. And when you are ready to look at the screen, you can just slide it back. So in the live session, you do have control over the relative size of the live action and the shared screen, which will be a mix of slides as you see now and Capstone when we jump into the actual activities. Finally, I just saw this Q&A. Will the session be recorded? Yes, you're going to receive a link to this by email tomorrow. I'll send it to you tomorrow. It is going to be a link to an unlisted YouTube movie, which means you can view it using all of YouTube's tools, wherever you can view YouTube. You're welcome to share this with colleagues who might not have been able to make it, and YouTube will have its own playback capabilities, captioning capabilities. We're going to go too fast for you to possibly follow along if you did happen to have the equipment. But for those of you who do have the equipment available or would just like to practice Capstone based on what we do today, you will have the recording and you can control the speed of playback when you get that recording tomorrow. Well, again, thanks for joining us. My name is Glenn Starkey. I'm here at PASCO headquarters with my colleague, Jonathan. I'm in the Curriculum and Professional Development Department. I focused on training and professional development. And Jonathan, do you want to chime in here and let us know a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan, and I'm in the engineering department officially at PASCO, but I spend a lot of time with Glenn and the rest of his colleagues in the curriculum department doing various things. And today, as Glenn said, I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A windows. So please ask questions as much as you like during the presentation, and we will answer those for you.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here, Jonathan. Jonathan has done trainings. He and I have been stuck in airports all around the world. And he's currently writing the help system for Capstone. So we'll take a look at that, and that's his handiwork. All right. So we've told you a little bit about ourselves. We'd like to know you in general. What's your experience level with PASCO Capstone? So I'm going to open up a poll here. And for those of you who are here live, you'll see that poll pop open in a window, and it asks you which best describes your use of PASCO Capstone. Are you a frequent user, an occasional user, or just taking a look for now? So, wow, majority have answered already. Let's let a few more come in. We appreciate your feedback, and in a moment, I'll close the poll and give you a chance to see the experience level of your fellow attendees. Great. All right, about 5 more seconds. All right, let me end that poll and share with you the results. This isn't the recording, so I'm going to narrate it out here. Which best describes your use of PASCO Capstone? Just over a quarter of you are frequent users, just under 40% occasional users, and 35%, over a third, are just taking a look for now. Well, whatever your category, I think you'll get something from today. We are going to start with the fundamentals. If you're an occasional user or just taking a look for now, if you are just taking a look for now, there is a free 60-day full-featured trial of Capstone. And even if you're a frequent user, we're going to dive pretty deep in some places, and you have the opportunity to ask questions wherever we are. So I appreciate you joining us, whatever your experience level. All right. So a little bit about PASCO Capstone. We're on version 2 now. This is PASCO's data collection and analysis software specifically for Windows and Mac computers. And it's designed with the tools in mind for higher level physics and engineering education, the upper level secondary and college university education labs. So we do have another piece of software called SparkView that runs on all platforms from Chromebook to the phone in your pocket. And it's for cross-disciplinary, many levels from elementary up through early college. But Capstone, which we'll focus on today, is really about the higher level analysis tools, specifically for physics and engineering. And that's not to say we don't have advanced chemistry teachers using all those tools to their fullest capabilities. But the examples we're going to focus on today will largely be in that physics engineering realm, but the tools apply across disciplines. Version 2 of Capstone was released just over 2 years ago in December 2019. And if you had a license for Capstone version 1, which had been out for almost a decade before that, or maybe 8 years before that, the upgrade to version 2 was free. We're currently on a version which was released end of December 2021. It's version 2.4.0, and all upgrades within 2.0 have also been free. And for those of you who are just checking it out for now, you can go to our website in the download section, and you'll see you can download a full featured 60-day trial. So if you have questions about Capstone's availability, feel free to send those in the Q&A. All right, as I mentioned, we have a busy session planned today. We're going to start with an activity looking at a mass on a spring with a motion sensor, and we're going to cover these fundamental skills here, but the key idea here is we're going to answer the question, how can I just graph some sensor data? Then we're going to jump over to an impulse and momentum demonstration. This will be the most time-consuming demonstration because we're going to go pretty deep and look at a wide variety of things that we can do in Capstone with analysis and data reporting. But this is going to answer the question, how can I take more control of data collection and analysis? Then we'll have a very quick activity called gas, pressure, and volume. And here we're going to say, you know what, we have an experiment where we don't really care about time. How can we collect data to show the relationship between gas, pressure, and volume for a gas in a syringe? And finally, I'll leave you with a wrap up of some resources. Where can you learn more beyond our session together today? All right, let us jump over to Capstone and the first demonstration. So this is going to be a quick investigation of a mass oscillating on a spring using a motion sensor. I'm going to switch over to show you our physical setup, and I will also switch over to Capstone. And this is what Capstone looks like when you first launch it. It creates a new file ready for you to set it up to collect and analyze data. So quick tour of Capstone before we jump into the data collection. You'll notice that we have big white space here. It happens to start out with some quick start options that would configure Capstone for a variety of uses. We'll take a look at one of those briefly. But this large white space where we're going to do the visualization and data analysis, the bulk of your work is here in this white space. This is called the Capstone Workbook space. And we currently have a one-page workbook. We can have multiple pages if our experiment gets a little more complex. Just like all applications on Windows and Mac computers, we have a traditional file menu system here. Here is Jonathan's help. It leads to a dynamic online help, so I encourage you to take a look at that. And the most frequently used buttons from the file edit workbook menus also have their duplicates here as buttons for opening and saving files, etc. We have a couple of workbook tools. These workbook tools let you add workbook pages. And you can see each workbook page shows up here as a tab. And then around the workbook space, we have three things that we call palettes. On the left side of the workbook space is the tools palette. This is for things like controlling what hardware is connected, seeing what data we've collected. Along the bottom below the workbook space is our controls palette for deciding how frequently to record and whether we're recording right now. And then along the right side, we have some displays palette that lets us choose primarily which data displays we'd like to see our data in, and those are the displays that will let us do analysis. So we're going to take advantage of these little quick start options here, and I'm interested in collecting some data from the motion sensor that you see here. This is our passport motion sensor in blue, and I have already connected it to one of our mid-range interfaces here, the 550 universal interface. I've simply plugged it in, the interface is on and connected via USB. We'll talk more about connections of sensors later. But what I want you to know is just off camera, above here, I have a 100-gram mass on a spring, and I'm going to oscillate this above the motion sensor once we set up the displays we want. Well, we're going to take advantage of these quick starts, and if I'm interested in sensor data, there's a nice prominent button in the top center here. If I hover over it, I get a tooltip in yellow that says connect your sensor and record data in a graph. That sounds just about right for this experiment and indeed for many experiments. So let me press on this sensor data button. And Capstone's going to go out and see if there are any connected sensors. It has found that my passport motion sensor is connected, and it's taken a prominent measurement from that sensor, position in this case, and by default plotted it on the y-axis against time. Well, it just so happens that that's what I'm interested in. If I want to change that measurement, I could. We'll learn more about that later, but position versus time is exactly what I'm looking for in this case. So let me start that mass on the spring in motion. So I'll pull it down a little bit farther so you can see it's right above there, above the motion sensor. It's moving up and down. How do I actually begin recording data? Well, I'm going to go down to this controls palette and hit the red record button. And you can see the mass is going up and down there above the motion sensor, and I'm getting a live plot of position versus time on my graph display. Note that the time axis was scaled to 10 seconds, but when I exceed that, the scale of the graph changes automatically. I'll go ahead and hit stop, and all the data that I collected between hitting record and stop is what Capstone calls a run of data. And if we look in the upper right of the graph, you'll see that there's this legend, as we call it. The legend tells me that I'm currently looking at run number 1, and it's assigned a color to help distinguish it if I collect multiple runs. So run number 1 is blue, and I can see it here, nice oscillation on the graph of position versus time. All right, so we have some data. I might want to take this data now and change my view of it. It expanded in the time axis, and if I had taken measurements where the position exceeded the range that was the default for my graph, it would also scale the y-axis. But I have control now over my view of the data. So I can click and drag with my regular cursor in the middle of the graph, and this is almost as if I have a traditional piece of graph paper and I'm just translating on the tabletop. So click and drag with your default cursor allows you to shift the graph left, right, up and down, and so forth. So you can change what's at the center of your graph just with the regular mouse cursor. Well, We can do one better than a traditional piece of graph paper, though. We can stretch it as if this graph paper is made of rubber. To stretch the graph and change its scaling of the axes, I'll take my same regular cursor and hover over the numbers on the y-axis or the numbers on the x-axis. And in either case, you'll notice that my cursor becomes a little two-headed arrow. And now I can click and drag toward the origin to compress this rubber-like sheet, or away from the origin to expand it. So through a combination of scaling on the X and Y and panning or moving in the center, I can change my view of the graph and focus in on any particular section of interest here. Here it's pretty repetitive, but if there was something I wanted to focus on, I can use this panning and scaling to do so. Now, most computers these days have a scroll wheel mouse or the same scrolling capability on a trackpad. I like to take advantage of that. If I were interested in zooming in or out to a particular point in the data, I can use my scroll wheel on my mouse to zoom in or zoom out right at the point where my cursor is. So I'm zooming in, zooming out over my cursor using the scroll wheel on my mouse. Now that same trick also works on the X and Y axes. So if I want to zoom in to 2.5 seconds, I'll bring my cursor over 2.5 on the X axis and I'll zoom out or zoom in using the scroll wheel. This is a neat way to quickly change my view in just one dimension using the scroll wheel. And of course, that same scroll trick works on the numbers on the Y axis. All right, so lots of control over how you're viewing the data inside your graph once you've collected it. Now, a lot of times our goal is to simply fill the available graph space with the data we've collected. I could go through the steps of doing that manually, but there is a button that will do this for us automatically. And this is going to be our introduction to the graph toolbar, which is above the graph. Now, sometimes you'll see the graph toolbar, sometimes you won't, depending on where your mouse cursor is. It dynamically hides as you go away from it. We're going to focus on it though, so I'm going to pin it so it's always visible by clicking on this little orange pin, and that ensures it's visible no matter the position of my cursor. All right, so first button here, probably the one I use the most. If I hover my cursor over it, you will notice that it gives me a little tooltip. It doesn't tell me the name of the button, but it does tell me the function of the button. And this is the button that will scale to fit. It'll scale the axes to show all data. So if I click on that, you'll notice that the X and Y axes scale and pan such that the data fills the available space with a little bit of buffer space there. All right. Now, one of the key things to using the toolbar, especially the graph toolbar in Capstone, is to understand that many of these buttons have two parts. The scale to fit button is one of those buttons. It has a left part that does the action, and it has a right part, which is a little black drop-down arrow. Throughout the toolbar, you're going to see a lot of buttons that have a little drop-down, and these give you options for how that button behaves. In this case, if I click on the right portion of the scale to fit button, you'll see I have only one option here. It is auto scale from 0. So if I check that on, you'll notice that the behavior of the left part of the button now is to scale so that the origin 0, 0 is always included. Right. So if I want to turn that option off, I return to the right part of the scale to fit button, click on it, and now the scaling is such that it does not include the origin, just shows the data that I've collected. All right, so another button that is useful and has two parts is the statistics button. Looks like the Greek letter sigma on the left part. If I click on the left part, it turns that button on and off. So this is a toggle turning on and off the statistics analysis of my data. The right portion has a few options here that allow me to control which statistics are being shown. So by default, mean is on. I'm also going to turn on minimum, maximum, and standard deviation. I'll click away from that. And you can see that all 4 of those requested statistics are now shown on the graph. And by default, statistics tools show up visually here. So it shows you where the mean is in addition to what the mean is. And does a neat little job here of showing you the fade of a standard deviation around that mean. Also the max and min there. So now that I've turned on the options with the black drop down right portion of the button, I can toggle the statistics on and off by just clicking on the left part. All right, so an introduction to collecting data and using those 2-part buttons. I'm going to quickly collect a second run of data here because we often have questions that are answered by changing some conditions. So I'm going to swap out the 100-gram mass for a 50-gram mass. So I now have half the mass on the same spring. And how do I record a second data? I simply hit the record button. So this time it'll definitely be out of screen, but I'm going to start oscillating this 50-gram mass above the motion sensor. I'm going to return and hit the record button. And now we can see that we have a new run called run number 2. It's in a new color, green, as indicated by the legend here. And I'll collect about 10 seconds of data from that lighter mass and hit stop. All right, so we could scale to fit and see our green run of data. It looks generally similar to the other. Can't really tell the difference here unless I'm looking at both runs at the same time. So let's see how we can look at multiple runs in the same graph at the same time. You'll notice by default, when I started recording run number 2, that run number 1 disappeared. Well, it's still there, it's in the file. Just for the sake of avoiding clutter, the default behavior of the graph is to show only the most recent run. But we can change that behavior using a button called the Data Selector button. Looks like a little rainbow triangle here, and it, once again, is a 2-part button. You might be wondering, how do I know the name of that button? When I hover over it, it tells me a tooltip that's not the name, but is the functionality. It says this allows simultaneous viewing of multiple data sets, or the right portion allows me to select visible data. Well, the way I know the name, here's a little trick. If I go to the eyeball at the far right of the graph toolbar, this is for showing and hiding tools. I could turn a tool on or off if I want to reduce the clutter in the toolbar, but notice it also tells me the name. So I looked here to figure out that was scale to fit. And we looked at the statistics tool, Sigma, and now we're looking at the data selector. So you don't need to know the names, but if you're writing instructions and care to know the names, this little eyeball tells you what the names are and also gives the option to hide or show tools. So let's return to the data selector. I'm going to start with the drop-down portion on the right, and this allows me to select which run is visible. You'll notice, though, if I select run 1, run 2 disappears and vice versa. So what we need to do is learn how to use the left portion of the button. And if I press the left part of the button, it appears nothing happens. But now when I return to the right part of the button, I can choose to have multiple runs visible at the same time. Now, this is a little complex behavior, so we've also made it a little bit easier. If you know you want to see multiple runs, you can also go to the drop-down arrow and just choose select all, and it will automatically depress that button on the left as well. So now if I were to collect a run number 3, it would also be visible along with runs number 1 and 2. All right. So one final key thing when you are dealing with multiple runs in a graph display, great for visual comparison, we still have the ability to turn on tools, but you'll notice that despite having 2 runs, I only have 1 graph toolbar. So the final thing we're going to figure out in this quick investigation is, how do I know which run the toolbar tools are going to apply to? Let's do a quick test here. I'm going to go back to statistics and turn it on by clicking on the left part of that button. And I notice that I get a green statistics here. It means it's analyzing run number 2. I could, of course, return and turn on whatever features I'm interested in using the right part. But how do I know that it was going to apply to run number 2? The answer is the idea of the active run. If we return to our legend in the upper right here, once you have multiple runs visible, you're going to notice that by default, only the most recent one is what we call active. And the active run is the run that the tools apply to. The active run is indicated by a shading in the background behind the symbol for the run. So we can see a light green shading here telling us that run number 2 is the active run. That means when I turn on and off tools, it applies to that. Obvious question now is, well, how do I make a different run active? If I want to make run number 1 active, I simply click on its symbol in the legend here. You'll notice a couple of things. One is that its background changes to the colored background here, indicating to me that it's the active run. It becomes a little more prominent on the graph. The inactive runs by default kind of fade in color. And now if I return to the statistics tool, I can turn it on for run number 2. A common question is, well, can I turn on multiple runs at the same time? It turns out you can make multiple runs active. You can either shift click in the shift-click their symbols, or new to a recent release of Capstone, you can also just click on the measurement symbol above the column of the runs you're interested in making active, and it will make all of them active at the same time, as you can see by the shaded backgrounds here. Now, another common question would be, are there analysis tools I can turn on at the same time across runs? And the answer is yes. Not all tools, so you have to turn on statistics individually run by run. But now that I have both runs selected, I could come over here to, say, the fit tool, and this looks pretty sinusoidal. So I'll turn on fit, and you'll notice it does a sine fit to both of these curves at the same time, because I had 2 active runs at the time when I turned that tool on. All right. So I'm going to save all of today's files. So if you want to figure out, what's the relationship here between mass and the frequency, you have all the information here to do that. But before I proceed to the next activity, Jonathan, any questions we should answer as a group? I see you've been answering them in the Q&A panel.
No, I think we're good for now.
All right, thanks for doing that. Keep up the questions. We appreciate learning what you are interested in. All right, so I want to jump over to a new activity. I'm going to create a new file for that. I'll go and unplug my motion sensor, which we won't be using for the next activity. And how do I create a new file? Well, you can only have one file open in Capstone at a time. So if you want to create a new file, actually, before I do that, let me show you, I forgot my favorite feature in Capstone here. Before I jump to the next activity, one thing I really love about Capstone is the ability to explore. Of course, we're using Capstone to explore the physical world around us, but Capstone has an ability to allow you and your students to explore, and that is unlimited undos. So if we go to the edit menu, you'll see that one of the options here is to undo, and it tells me the last thing I did was curve fit annotation box moved by mouse. I undo so much that I'm definitely going to remember the keyboard shortcut, Control Z on Windows and Command Z on a Mac. You can also use this reverse button here, but if I hit Control Z or that blue button, you notice it undoes the last thing. And if I hit Control Z again, it undoes the previous thing. And let me just hold Control Z here, and it's going to step back through absolutely every single thing that I did in this lab. It's going to take a moment for Zoom to catch up there because it went so fast, but that was basically a reverse animation of every step I took. And as long as I don't bifurcate at any point, I can also use the redo or Control Y. And I'll press and hold Control Y here, and it's going to go through every single step that I just did in the lab, ending up at the final point there. That didn't come across very well in Zoom, but all 40, 50 steps in there were undone and then redone. So if you don't know what something does, look for a tool tip by hovering over it. If you still don't understand it, just try it. You can always Control Z, Command Z, undo. All right, so now that I've redone everything, I'm back at a state I think is useful here. I'm going to create a new experiment to jump into the next activity. How do we create a new experiment? One way to do it is to go to the File menu and choose New Experiment. And because Capstone has only one experiment open at a time, it's going to allow me to choose whether I want to save this current file with the mass on a spring data. I would like to save it so I can share it with you. So I'm going to choose Save, and Capstone files, we'll talk more about this later, are saved with the extension .cap. They can be opened in any version of Capstone, whether Mac or Windows. So let me call this mass on spring data. And I will share that Capstone file with you. So whether you have the trial or the full version of Capstone, you can go ahead and analyze that data we've collected or even add your own data. All right. So before we jump into the next one, Jonathan's been ably answering those questions. Thanks, Jonathan. If you have questions as we go, please don't hesitate to ask them. I just did an activity featuring what I call the passport motion sensor. This is a motion sensor from a line of sensors we started designing around 2001, turn of the millennium. But this will look familiar to you if you have PASCO sensors, because in the 1990s, we designed a similar looking motion sensor that we called Science Workshop, typically a black sensor. And starting in the mid 2010s, as cell phones made Bluetooth very easy and ubiquitous, we started designing wireless sensors. So here are 3 generations of sensors starting in the last millennium, probably older than most of your students, into the early 2000s with our passport line, taking advantage of USB, and finally the modern era of wireless sensors. The great news is that Capstone supports all of these, but I'd be curious to learn if you have any PASCO sensors already, which do you have? The black line of Science Workshop sensors, the blue line of Passport, or the most recent line, the wireless white sensors. So let me open one more poll here. And if you have sensors, we'd love to hear which sensor line or lines you have. And this question allows for more than one answer if you have more than one line. Which line of PASCO sensors do you have? Science Workshop, the black sensors, Passport, mostly blue, wireless, mostly white, or none yet. So getting a lot of responses. Thanks for your feedback. I'll leave it open for about 10 more seconds. Great. Thanks for your input. Let me share those results with you. And we find that almost a third of you have the black Science Workshop sensors, 44% the blue Passport sensors, 12% have wireless white sensors, and about 26% don't have any PASCO sensors yet. So as I mentioned, the key here is that our engineers put a lot of time into making sure even those older Science Workshop sensors are supported. So the sensor on the left was created in the last millennium. It still works with the latest version of PASCO Capstone released 20 some years later. All right, so I am going to do another demonstration here. This is Impulse Momentum. I'll stop the poll there. Thanks for your feedback. And in this one, I'm going to mix and match multiple generations of sensors. I'm going to use a Science Workshop motion sensor, and I'm also going to use a Passport force sensor. So we'll mix and match generations. These are the two older lines, and I want to show you how these connect before in our third activity later, we'll learn how to connect wireless sensors. So let me show you in the background here what setup we have going. So I'm interested in this activity and seeing, is there a relationship if I have a cart undergo collision between the change in momentum of that cart and the impulse it experiences. So when we're talking about momentum and impulse, we have to figure out what sensors are available for us to make measurements. And in the background here, we have a 1.2 meter track. And on the 1.2 meter track, I have a pass car. This car, I have a mass on it, and this will roll freely left and right on this 1.2 meter track. Now, on the far left of this track, I have mounted, here's a close-up of another one, a high-resolution Passport force sensor. So that's mounted on the end of the track. And what I've done that's special to this experiment is I've taken the traditional hook accessory off of this high-resolution force sensor, and I've added a little spring accessory to that same spot. So as I push the cart to the left, it is initially at least going to bounce off of a light spring that's attached to that force sensor, and that force sensor at the end of the track can tell us about the force during that collision. All right, so we're going to get some information about velocity from that ultimately. Now on the right side of the track, I have clipped a Science Workshop generation motion sensor. I didn't mention this earlier, but the way the motion sensors work across all generations is that they send out little ultrasonic chirps from this gold foil. They hit an object in front of it, hopefully the object you design it to hit. In this case, the sensor is pointing at the cart on the track, and then it listens for the echo coming back from the reflection of sound from that cart. And from that round trip time and the average speed of sound and air, it determines the distance to that cart, and from that distance it can derive the velocity and acceleration as derivatives. All right, so that's our physical setup for impulse momentum. And we now need to set up Capstone and set up the measurements on the interface. So I'm going to continue to use the 550 interface that you see here on the bottom left of the live video. And I'm going to return to Capstone with my new file. And this time, we're not going to use one of these quick setups here. We're going to dive in and see how we can take full control over the configuration of our hardware, our sampling conditions, and our displays. So I'm going to begin in the tools palette along the left side. I usually begin with this first button here, hardware setup. How are we going to tell Capstone which sensors we want to measure from and what measurements we want? Well, right now I have the 550 connected and on, and Capstone detects it as shown by the image in Capstone here. And these different generations of sensors connect in different ways. So I'm going to take the plug from the high resolution force sensor, the Passport sensor that you see in the back left there. And all I need to do is plug it into an appropriate port on my 550 interface. I'll plug it into Passport port number 1. By the way, I happen to be using a 550, but we have interfaces that range from the multi-generational 550 to simple interfaces like this AirLink that will take one Passport sensor. All of these interfaces will work with those generations of sensors and allow you to use your sensors with Capstone. Now I'm going to unplug that sensor again because I want you to pay attention in Capstone. Notice as soon as I plug in a Passport sensor, Capstone recognizes that a sensor has been plugged in and it actually identifies it. So Passport is auto-identifying, and it knows that I've connected a high-resolution force sensor here on channel P1. Onto the Science Workshop motion sensor. Well, the Science Workshop generation of motion sensors had this fairly unique set of plugs. There's a yellow plug and a black plug, and those are going to go into the Science Workshop digital ports on my 550 interface. I just need to know which goes where. Basically, the signal to chirp is going to go out on yellow, and the echo is going to come back on black. And the way it works is the color yellow is on the left, so I'll plug that into digital channel 1, and I'll plug the other 1/4 inch stereo headphone jack there into the right channel 2. So I've connected those two sensors, or those two plugs of the Science Workshop motion sensor, but you'll notice that nothing's happened here in Capstone. That's because the original Science Workshop generation of sensors did not auto-identify. No worries though, I just need to tell Capstone what I just plugged in. I can do that by clicking on the yellow circle on the port number 1 that I just connected, and it pops open a list of the filtered sensors that could possibly fit there across the generations. So here's a long list of sensors. If I want to save some time, if I know it's a motion sensor, I just start typing MO, and it filters down to motion, and I click on it and it connects it. So passport, automatically identified, Science Workshop, plug it in and then identify it yourself by clicking on the port yellow circle to identify it. All right, so I've connected these two sensors, and before we proceed, I want to note that these two sensors are kind of facing different ways. The force sensor that you see on the far left, by default, it considers to our right to be positive, whereas the motion sensor over here considers to our left to be positive. I want to reconcile those two directions, and I can do that by diving into the hardware setup panel here for the motion sensor. I like the convention that positive for both sensors is to the right, to our right in the video. So throughout Capstone, you're going to see these gears. These gears are property gears that let you dive down deeper into the particular configuration. I'm going to click on the property gear for the motion sensor here in the hardware setup. I will click on it, and it gives me a lot of options for the properties of the motion sensor, from zeroing it to just information about its sample rate options. I'm going to come in here and note the second line says change sign. I'm going to click on that, and that changes the sign of the sensor's measurement. So after I check that, just from prior experience, I know now to the right is going to be positive for its position, velocity, acceleration measurements. So it's reconciled with the direction of positive for the force sensor. All right. So that's the hardware setup. I usually start here. I'm going to click now on the next button down in our tools palette, the data summary. You'll notice that only one palette's open at a time. So if I click on data summary, the hardware setup panel hides by default. So I'm going to go to data summary, and data summary lists all of the data sources and collected runs in your file. Now, right now, we can see it's identifying the sensors that we connected in hardware setup, and it's telling us what measurements are available from those sensors. Notice that the high resolution force sensor just measures force, whereas the motion sensor measures position, velocity, and acceleration, all derived from that echo time, where position is from the echo time plus speed of sound, velocity is the first derivative, acceleration is the second derivative, and so forth. All right, so what else happens in our data summary? Well, if I were to actually collect a run of data, I'll hit record for a moment here just to get a dummy run. You'll notice that now it notes that a run number 1 was collected for each of these measurements. So your data is always going to live in the data summary. Notice I have no displays in this lab yet. That doesn't mean I can't have data. The data just resides here in data summary. Well, that was just a test run. So I'm going to either undo with Control or Command Z, or there's an explicit button for deleting the last run in the controls palette down here. So I'm going to press delete last run, and I'm back to having the measurements available, but no data yet collected. So I think I've done all I need to in the tools palette for now. Let us go down here to the controls palette. We're going to collect data here, hitting the record button in a bit. But first, this is a lab that benefits from tweaking the default sampling for each of the two sensors involved. So let me go here and note that I can choose between these two sensors, motion and high resolution force. And for each of these, I can set what we call the sample rate. This is how often the data is recorded from the sensor. In most labs, you probably want a common sample rate across sensors. So you can choose common rate and go up and down, and it will set the sample rate for all connected sensors. This lab is unique, and one of the reasons I choose it is this lab benefits from sampling the force really fast because this collision is going to be quite short in time between the cart and that spring. But the motion sensor, all I care about is what's the velocity going in and coming out, so it can be slower. So in this case, I'm going to first set the motion sensor's sample rate to about 50 Hertz. That means it's going to collect 50 samples every second of position, velocity, acceleration once I hit record. Notice that there's an ability here to zero the motion sensor. I'm not going to take advantage of that ability right here, but some sensors can be zeroed in software, and when they can, you will see a zero button. I'm going to switch from motion sensor to my high resolution force sensor. In this sensor, I want a lot of detail during the collision. So I'm going to boost its sample rate up to about 500 hertz. So 10 times as frequent data collection as the motion sensor. Now, I definitely want to zero this sensor, but it turns out this passport generation does not have a software zero. It has a hardware zero. And if I pull this other force sensor near the camera, you'll note that there's a zero button on the sensor itself right there. So I'm going to, with the sensor plugged in, simply go over to the force sensor that's on the end of the track, press its zero button. Right? And that ensures that I'm going to get a zero reading before and after the collision happens. All right, so I think I'm set up here in the controls palette. I'd like some displays though, and we're going to begin with the most commonly used display in Capstone, the graph display. But there's a little trick here in that we want to graph more than one thing. So let's begin looking at the displays palette along the right side. You'll notice this gives us the ability to add displays from more traditional data displays like graphs, tables, digits, to displays used a little less frequently, like FFTs and scopes, meter displays, along with other things like adding videos and images. We're going to cover some of these things in a future session, but today let's start by focusing on the graph display. And if I hover my cursor over the graph display, notice that the tooltip tells us that there are actually two ways to add a graph to our workbook page. One of those ways is to drag the graph to the page. The other is to double click. I'm going to start by double clicking. So I'll double click on the graph display and we see that it adds a full page graph to my workbook. Now we can continue doing this. If I want another graph display, I return to the graph icon in the displays palette, I double click again and notice that Capstone intelligently resizes the first graph as it adds the second. And I could continue with more graphs or other displays just by double clicking, and it adds one of those each time and shrinks the previous ones so that they don't overlap. I'm going to undo that a couple steps here. So let's imagine that we want to measure something from the force sensor and something from the motion sensor. This is a potential configuration. I could put velocity on the left graph versus time and force on the right graph versus time, but notice that we don't really have a correspondence between the two graphs. So these will both be correct, but it might be difficult to interpret. So I'm going to undo that and show you the other option for getting displays onto our workbook is to click and drag them. And this will give us a little more control over their positioning. So I already have one graph on the screen. I'm going to click and drag out a second graph. And you'll notice that I have these little blue boxes. And if I hover over a blue box, it gives me a preview of where this new graph will be dropped if I release it at that point. Well, let's say I want the new graph at the bottom half of my workbook page. So I'll hover over this blue box here and release. It resizes the previous graph, sliding in the new graph on the bottom. So clicking and dragging onto those blue boxes gives you a lot of control over the positioning. Now, this seems a little more promising. I kind of have the x-axes aligned, but there's a bit of a problem in that you'll notice that they aren't actually synced together because these are fundamentally two different graph displays. All right. So I'm going to undo that once again and show you that when you are dealing with multiple measurements that you want to see synchronized in time, usually the right answer is to have just one graph display, which I already have here, and to modify what's inside that graph display. So let's begin by identifying that this graph display doesn't show me any measurements yet. Notice it gives me the opportunity to click on the y-axis, the select measurement button, or the x-axis, and select which measurement is shown on that axis. So I'm going to start on the y-axis, select measurement button. I'll click on it and a menu pops open with all the possible measurements in my experiment. You'll notice these are the same measurements that were in the data summary. Well, I'd like the velocity to be shown here. I filled in the y-axis measurement with velocity, and notice by default it changed the x-axis to time. There has to be something there. Time is the default. It happens to be what we want in this experiment, but it could be changed to something else by just clicking on it. All right, so I have one of two things available here, velocity versus time. I still want force versus time. Let me show you two ways that I can change this single graph display to show me two different measurements. Both of these abilities are here in the graph toolbar. They have little green sparkles. The one on the left is to add a new y-axis to the active plot. So I'm going to click on that, and you'll notice that within the same graph display, I now have a second y-axis over here on the right. And if I wanted to, I could choose force there. And now I have a shared time axis, and I have velocity on the left y-axis and force on the right y-axis. Now, When these units are different, I just mentally have a lot of trouble keeping things straight. So I'm going to undo that and show you my favorite way when two measurements are showing on the same graph and have different units. Here's what I like to do. I'm going to return to this graph toolbar, and I'm going to choose this option, add new plot area. All right, I'll click on that. Let's see what a plot area is. So in this case, I still have one graph display, but it's been subdivided into two plot areas. One on the top has its own y-axis, velocity. The one on the bottom can have its own y-axis. Let me make that force. But they share a time axis, so they're going to remain aligned in time, because instead of creating a second graph, I created a second plot area within the same graph. All right. Jonathan, any questions about the configuration? We've set up the hardware, the sampling conditions, and the displays before we collect data. Let's see if there's anything.
Yeah, I was just answering one in the chat about deleting. It says, how do you delete a graph instead of just undoing it? So yep. I answered both about the graph and the run, so you might want to expand on that.
Certainly. Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for your questions as well. So I can, of course, undo things, but if I've forgotten how long ago I undid it, I might explicitly want to get rid of a graph. If I want to get rid of a plot area, what I will do is click on the plot area, and it has a subtle blue border around it. I can then hit the delete key on my keyboard, or I can hit this red X. And if I click on it, you'll notice that goes away. I'm going to undo that because I actually wanted it. By contrast, if I want to get rid of this entire graph display, I'm going to go to its border and click on it. The border goes from a light blue to a dark blue. And now I can hit the delete key on my keyboard, and it's going to say, hey, wait a minute, are you sure you want to delete this display? I can, of course, hit OK, because if I really do want it, I can undo and get back to it. Thanks for your question. Thanks, Jonathan, for responding to those in chat and Q&A. All right, I think I'm almost ready to collect data here. I've zeroed the sensor. I often forget to zero the force sensor. I've set the sample rates to be what I expect here. And let's say we're just doing kind of a discovery-based experiment here. In a moment, I'm going to do the following with our setup. Zoom in slightly here. I'm going to push this cart toward the spring and just let it bounce back and catch it before it hits the motion sensor that's on the right. Now, one thing I'm going to make sure I do is I'm not going to put my hand between the motion sensor and the cart, because then it would just be measuring the position of my hand instead of the cart. So when I push the motion sensor, I'm going to grab it by the side, push it towards the spring, and let it bounce back and catch it. All right. Now, right before I push it, though, I'm going to hit record, and right after it bounces back, I'm going to hit the stop button. So let's try recording a run of data that will include both the velocity time graph on the top and the force versus time graph on the bottom. So record, push, catch. All right. So I'll scale to fit, which is a good starting point. And now let's notice that the section of interest here is kind of when the collision happens, which is clear in the force versus time graph. I'm going to zoom in using my scroll wheel on just the x-axis right about there. I'll scale things. And now we can begin to ask some questions like, what happened to the velocity? What happened to the force? Well, the force is pretty clear. The collision began here and the force increased until the cart stopped. And then the cart started going to the right. So this is a force applied to the positive direction. The cart was going in the negative direction initially, so negative velocity. It stopped momentarily there when the spring was fully compressed, and then it sprang back toward the right. So this all makes sense in terms of our positive conventions to the right. But of course, we might want to quantify this a little bit. One question we could ask is, well, by how much did the velocity change? What was the incoming velocity? What was the outgoing velocity? So we're going to begin to explore some of these additional graph tools up here. And the tool that's great for finding the exact position of a data point, the coordinates of that point, is called the coordinates tool. It looks like this crosshairs, and if I hover over it, it says add the coordinates tool. When I click on it, it actually gives me quite a few options. We've added to the numbers of coordinates tools over the years, but I'm going to choose this first one, just the plain old coordinates tool. When I do that, I will see that I get a crosshairs in the graph. There is a gray box that I can grab, and attached to that gray box is a little note that tells me the actual coordinates of the center of that gray box. And you'll notice that as I move it around, it tells me I'm currently at 1.14 seconds, 0.21 meters per second. All right, that's the position of this gray box. Now, this gets really useful, of course, when we actually go towards data points, and it's going to jump on the nearest data point. So if I wanted to measure the position and time, or the velocity and time rather, of this point, I'll simply drop it. At that point, the note turns the color of the run, and this tells me that I am indeed now looking at the coordinates, 1.14 seconds, x, negative 0.66 meters per second, y of this point. By the way, once you're on a point, you can click on the label here and nudge left and right, or you can do the same thing with the keyboard arrows. So I can go point by point here, seeing the coordinates of the particular point that this is pointing to. All right, so that's one way to add a coordinates tool. There is another way to add a coordinates tool, and I find this even quicker. If I know that I want a coordinates tool, say right here after the collision, I'm simply going to take my cursor and click on it. And new to a recent version of Capstone, that just pops open some tools. And one of those tools you may recognize as the coordinates tool. So all I'm doing is clicking and choosing the coordinates tool from the pop-up. And that, of course, gives me just the same type of coordinates tool. And from here, I can determine that coming into the collision, the cart was going negative 0.66 meters per second, coming out 0.64 meters per second. All right. So if I didn't want to do the math and my question was fundamentally what was the change in velocity, let me show you that I can delete this second coordinates tool by clicking on it and hitting X. And let me return to the single coordinates tool that I have here at the incoming velocity. I'll click on it and notice there's actually this symbol here called delta. All right, this is the delta tool, and it's kind of a tool hidden within the coordinates tool. So if you have a coordinates tool, click on its little title or click on its little note here, and you'll see that you get a pop-up for the delta tool. Let's see what the delta tool does hidden inside the coordinates here. When I click on it, you'll notice that I have the original coordinates handle, but I now have a second handle, and I can drag this second handle out and drop it on a data point, and notice that the delta tool does the math for me. It says that from this origin point where the coordinates tool started to this point where I dropped the handle of the delta tool was a change in time along the x of 0.18 seconds and a change in velocity of 1.29 meters per second. So it essentially does the math for me, giving me the lengths of the edges of this box. All right, I can still move either of these handles to look at a different delta, but the delta tool hidden within the coordinates tool is a really useful thing for determining changes in your graph. All right, so I've determined that the change of velocity is 1.29 meters per second. That's the effect of a force. And on the bottom plot, we can see the force being applied over time. And we might want to start connecting these. We're going to make a conceptual leap here because we know the physics and say, well, I wonder what the area under that curve is. What is the area under this force versus time curve? So let me show you one important thing here. If I wanted to turn on a tool, we have an area tool. Besides having the concept of an active run, we have the concept of an active plot area. If I asked you which run is active, you would be correct in saying it's run 1 because it's active in this plot area and it's active in this plot area. But which tool will the area tool apply to? Well, it's going to apply to the active plot area's active run. And in this case, it's kind of subtle, but I can see that this top plot area of velocity time is active because it has a very subtle blue border around it. So I want to first make this bottom plot area active. I will click on it, and this light blue highlight moves around it. So simply click on the plot area to move the active plot area selector here. So with the lower plot area active and run number 1 active as well, I'm going to go to the graph toolbar and turn on this tool that's new to us called the area tool. And when I click on it, it displays the area between the curve and the y=0 axis, which is probably pretty good in this case because I zeroed the sensor. But if I zoom in here with the scroll wheel, you'll notice it is also accounting for the area here when that spring might have been shaking back and forth a little bit, oscillating. So to be a little more precise, I want to show you that we can confine the analysis of the area and other tools to just a certain section of our run. To do that, I need to introduce you to the highlighter. So with this lower plot area active, I'm going to go up to the graph and show you that this yellow highlighter-like symbol is called the highlighter. And if I click on it, it is going to drop a highlighter on the active plot area. Now, if I bring the if I bring the highlighter over my data, notice that all of the data points inside the box are highlighted, and my analysis tool, in this case area, updates itself so that it's analyzing the area only underneath the points highlighted in yellow, that is inside the box. Now I can move the box around. I can also grab the handles of the box, and I can adjust this highlighter so that the area tool is only analyzing the area under the curve during that collision. So things like curve fits, area tool, statistics can all be confined to portions of a run by turning on a highlighter. All right, well, I think we have some good data here. We determined how much oomph there was, how much force over time. We have that area, and we have the change in velocity that resulted from that collision. So I might want to start recording this data somewhere, because I certainly want to do another collision here in a moment. But how can I record the data? Well, we could write this down on paper. We could type it in a corresponding Excel spreadsheet. In this case, I'm going to show you that we can actually use the table in Capstone to have some metadata to begin recording data about our data from sensors. So I'd like to add a table to my page. I want the table to be on the lower half. So I'm going to drag this table icon from the displays palette and drag it so that I drop it on this little blue box, and this blue highlight tells me that this is going to occupy the bottom half of the workbook space. So I'll click on that, and there we can see the graph shrinks. The table is inserted in the bottom half. And let me turn off the title here by right-clicking, give us a little more space. Now, I want more space for the graph than for the table. By default, clicking and dragging gave me 50-50. So here's a not so well documented trick. I can change the size of multiple displays by hovering my cursor between the displays until I get this little blue dashed line. At this point, I can click and drag up or down, and it dynamically changes the relative size of these two displays. So I'd like the table to be a bit smaller. I'll drag it downwards, and the graph expands to fill the space that's voided by the shrinking table. All right, so I think we're pretty good here. What am I going to record in the table? Well, I'm definitely going to record the area under the curve. I'm going to record the change in velocity. I'm also going to record the conditions of my trial. And I basically want this table to be filled with data that I type in. So I'm going to begin by just typing some data in the first column, first cell here. I'm going to call this the trial. And I'm going to say that this is a soft spring, 1 bar mass on the cart. And the cart was going fairly slow. So I've just named this the trial name. And as soon as I start typing in a cell, an empty cell in an empty column, Capstone says, oh, you must want to type some user data. It says, this is called user data. Not a very good name, but a good starting name. I'm going to click on that and choose rename. And I'm going to call this set of data trial. And for the units, I'll hit tab to access units. I'm going to delete the units since this is just a qualitative name. And now I'm creating a set of data with the description of the trial. Well, table data can not only be descriptive, it can also be numerical. So I'm going to come here to the second column and click in the first cell. And I'd like this to be the change in velocity. So 1.29 meters per second is my first value. I'll just start typing that. And it says, oh, you want another set of user data. I'll rename that by clicking on it. And this is going to be V, but I actually wanted to see change in V. By the way, I can type whatever I want. It doesn't have to be the abbreviation. I could type change in velocity, but let me keep it succinct and choose V. I'm going to show you that another thing we can do in Capstone often is right click to reveal hidden options. So if I want a delta symbol, I'm going to right click in front of the symbol, the letter V, and I have the ability to insert subscripts, superscripts, Greek letters, or special characters like degrees symbols or delta. So I can quickly get delta V there by right clicking if I don't remember the keyboard shortcut for it, and I certainly don't. All right, and this is going to be in meters per second. And finally, I might want to add another column for the area under the curve here. I seem to have run out of columns in the table, but I can go over here to this column insert button on our table toolbar, and that's going to insert a column to the right, and I could type in 0.669, 0.669. Hit enter, it creates yet another user entered data set, which I can rename as, oh, I don't know, maybe J. And I already see that the units from the area tool here are Newton seconds. All right. Great. So we've begun our analysis here, and you can imagine continuing this. I might change the spring from a soft spring to a hard spring or a piece of clay. I might have a fast trial or a slow trial. In each case, I'm going to record a run of data, and I'm going to do the same analyses here using the delta tool, feature of coordinates, and the area tool. Now, I don't want to waste your time because that's just repeated steps. So I've actually collected a set of data right before this session. I'm going to open that up. So I'm going to go to File, Open Experiment. I'll discard the data I've collected here. And using this same setup, I collected some data exactly the same way. And I already did the analysis of changes in velocity and the area under the curve. Okay. So there you can see 5 trials, varying springs and clay bumpers, varying speeds, all with 1 bar mass. And for each, I determined the change in velocity and the this value J, the area under the curve. So the reason I did this is we can kind of take a discovery approach to this. There seems to be some correlation here. Larger changes in velocity seem to correspond to larger J's, larger areas under the curve. And if we want to actually quantify that relationship, we might ask ourselves, well, what would happen if I plotted one against the other? What if I plotted the J versus the delta V? Now, I don't really have enough room on this page to do it. I could add more graphs, but things would get pretty small. So I'm going to add a second graph page by going up here to the workbook tools, or the second workbook page, I should say. And I'm going to click on this to add a second workbook page. So now I have page number 2 and the original page number 1. So the new page is simply inserted after the current page. Now, what do I want on page number 2? Well, I do still want my data here. So I'm going to click on the edge of my table. I'm going to choose Edit, Copy, or Control C, Command C on a Mac. I'll go to page 2, Control V, Command V, and it fills in that same space on page number 2 with that same table. I'd like a graph on the top, but this is going to be a different graph. So let me drop that here in the center and let me plot J on the y-axis. And notice that our graphs can contain any sort of data. It could be data from a sensor, or it could be data that I typed in another table. So I'm going to choose J here, and I'm going to change the x-axis. We don't care the index. We care to compare it to the change in velocity. So there we go. We see all 5 pairs here of this area under the curve J versus the change in velocity. And hey, looks like a pretty straight line here, although it's a little bit confusing because it seems to jump back and forth. So I'm going to remove the connecting lines between these data points. There are 2 ways to do this. One is to go to this settings or properties button for the graph. And there are tons and tons of settings here. I can change the symbols. I can change whether the lines are showing, whether the data points are showing. I could turn off connecting lines here, but this is done fairly frequently. So another way to do it is to return to the graph and right click on a data point. And that gives you the option to turn on and off data points, visibility, or connecting lines very quickly. So I'll turn that off. We see that we have 5 distinct data points here. And boy, that sure looks like a straight line. So I'm going to go to our curve fits, click on this drop down, and choose one of the curve fits that I think will be appropriate, perhaps linear. And when I head back here, I can see that indeed visually looks great. And this correlation coefficient is 1.000, which indicates, yeah, that's a great fit. So a linear fit represents this quite well. All right, so here's a little trick. What is the slope? Well, the slope happens to be 0.500. And at this point, we could lead students to say, well, what do you think that might be? First of all, what are its units? And if we did the unit cancellation here, we'd see that the units are kilograms. And what does that maybe correspond to in our physical experiment? Well, if I were to take this 250-gram cart with a 250-gram mass and put it on balance, I did so earlier, and it's just off of about 0.5 kilograms. It's 0.512 kilograms. So we might be able to guide students to this discovery that, hey, this correlation between J and change in velocity might be the mass of the object that's doing the colliding. So let's presume that's the case, and let's test it. If we head back to page 1 here, we might now say, well, if the slope was m, that means if we multiply m, the mass of the cart, times delta v, that should actually be J, shouldn't it? So let's do a calculation within the table. This is kind of like adding a column in Excel, a calculated column. So instead of just adding a normal column and typing it in using a calculator, I'm going to go to this button here in the table that allows me to insert a new calculated column. I'll click on it, and I get an Excel-like line that, basically asks, so what do you want to calculate in this new column? It defaults to showing the previous column, which is the change in velocity. I like that. And I'm going to multiply by mass. I didn't actually put in mass yet, so let me undo that. Control Z. And I'm going to insert a regular column to the right here, and I'm going to call this the mass. And I did measure the mass as 0.512 kilograms for this combination of the PASCO plus this particular nominally 0.25 kilogram mass. So it was 0.512 for all those. Of course, we could change that by adding masses. And this was the mass of the cart in kilograms. And now I'm ready to do the insertion of the calculated column, where I'm going to multiply the mass times, all right, that's the asterisk, shift 8 on my US keyboard. Now here's the tricky bit. How do I insert all of the measurements of delta V? Well, again, we right click. If I right click, I get the ability to insert symbols, or if I go to the top, I can insert whole data sets. In this case, I want it to be the change in velocity. So mass times change in velocity. It does the calculations for me, and I might properly rename this. Hey, that's change in momentum, isn't it? Right click, delta P kilogram meters per second. Now you might ask, what controls the number of digits shown? It defaults to 2 in this case, but I can come up here and add another digit. And if we make the visual comparison here between the change in momentum, which is the mass times the change of velocity, we can see it correlates pretty well with this thing J, that we might give a name of impulse. And of course, I could add more columns. I could do percent difference by clicking here, inserting calculated column, and say that, well, the percent difference is going to be the impulse minus the change in momentum divided by, right click, insert data, J times 100. And here's our percent difference. All right. So that was a fairly deep dive, especially about being able to collect data and do meta-analysis within Capstone. I want to stop here and ask if there are any questions in the chat or anything we should raise verbally, Jonathan. And then I'm going to wrap this activity up before we jump to the next one by showing you what we can do with this file now that we've collected this data.
I think we got the questions covered for right now.
Thanks again. Keep the questions coming, and thanks, Jonathan, for managing those. All right, so I now have a file that has some data. It seems like I've discovered something neat here, relationship between change of momentum and impulse. I could continue collecting more data with different masses, but let's say I'm done now and I want to report this out. So let's talk about what we can do with the Capstone file once we've collected and analyzed data in it. One thing we can do is save the file. I alluded to this earlier, but if I go to File, Save Experiment As, it will be saved as a Capstone file, and I'm going to call this one Impulse Momentum, and I'll call this one Data Analyzed. It will have the extension .cap, and I can send this to someone else who has Capstone on their computer, whether it's Windows or Mac. They'll be able to open it up, and they'll have all the same data, displays, and analysis that I left with. So some instructors have students hand in the entire file if you, the instructor, wants to see every bit of this. And of course, that gives us the capability to collect more runs, maybe in another lab period, or to do further analysis, perhaps outside of the lab. All right, so that's the entire Capstone file saved and preserved. Now, there are other things I might want to do. I may want to, say, write a report in Google Docs or Word, and I might want this graph to be part of my report. So I'm going to come here and click on the graph display here. Its border turns dark blue, and I can either go to the edit menu and choose copy or hit Control or Command C. And I'm going to come over here and say, you know what, I'm going to write my submission here in Word, and I can hit Control V and it pastes in an image of that graph. Now, importantly, this is merely an image of the graph. I can't go in and adjust this area tool, for example, but it is an image that I could begin writing about in my submission here. So copying and pasting a graph image is a popular way to report out what you've been doing to supplement a written report. I could, of course, print this out on a physical printer if you're using physical lab notebooks. Another thing I might want to do is perhaps take this data in the table and bring it into, say, Excel or Google Sheets for further analysis. Well, your first thought, having seen my copying and pasting of the graph, would be, let me just click on the table, hit Control C, head over to Excel, and hit Control V. All right, that seems to have worked, but you have to be cautious. This is just giving me a picture of the table. So let me undo that. I'll delete that. Let's head back to the table. What would I really want to do here? I'm going to click inside a cell of the table, and I'm going to hit Control or Command A for all. It's going to select all of the cells. I'll hit Control or Command C for copy. And now if I head to Excel, click in the first cell, Control V, now I actually have all the cells values here in Excel where I could collate data from different groups, or I could just write a report that's Excel based. All right, so copying and pasting values out of the table itself involves selecting Control A, all the cells, and then Control C or Command C to copy and then paste. Now, there's a more formal way to get actual data out of Capstone in a way that can be brought into Excel or Google Sheets, and that is in the File menu. I can choose to formally export data, and this opens a dialog that gives me a lot more options. I can choose here all the measurements that I want to export and the specific runs that I want to export, and I can even choose whether I want to export it as comma separated values or CSV files or tab delimited values. Pretty much any data package can open either of these, but you may have a preference on your computer for tab delimited, which has extension .txt, I believe, or .tab, and comma separated values, which will have the extension .csv.
I think tab delimited is TSV, if I recall correctly.
TSV, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
There have been some changes to that lately. Thanks for the update. All right. So that's how we can get this information out of Capstone or preserve the Capstone file for collecting data later or doing further analysis. So I kind of developed this lab myself. It's of course based on labs that have been done with sensors for a long, long time. But as we look to see if we have more questions, let me tell you, if you wanted to do a lab with Impulse, you might be asking, so where do I get these resources if I don't make it up myself or my students don't make it up themselves? Before I do that though, I would be remiss to not mention the following. I very intentionally showed you how to do this lab with a mix of hardware across generations, a 550 interface, a Science Workshop generation motion sensor, a PASCO and a Passport generation force sensor. But if you were doing this from scratch these days, I just want you to know that it can be done with a lot less equipment. This piece of equipment right here can just be slammed into a wall with a spring on it, and it will measure the velocity because it has spinning wheels and an internal optical encoder for position, velocity, acceleration. It has a built-in force sensor, so I can see the collision force here, and I could do this entire experiment with just this thing. No other interface needed, no other sensors needed, no other cart needed. So this is the wireless smart cart. As technology progresses, you can do neater and neater things at lower and lower costs. So I've intentionally showed you how to do it across generations here, but there is a way to do it with even our wireless sensors with just this single wireless sensor. All right, but how can I find out, where do I get information about these labs? Well, let me show you our website briefly. I'm going to go to a part of our website at pasco.com called the Experiment Library. So let me bring my browser onto screen here and start at pasco.com, our website. If you go to resources, the first link here is Experiment Library along the left, and we have over 1,000 labs in our Experiment Library. We used to sell lab manuals, and recently we've basically taken all of those labs and fed them into our Experiment Library such that they're over 1,000 and they are free. So how would I use the Experiment Library if I were interested in an Impulse lab? Well, I might begin by typing in a keyword like Impulse and hit filter, and that's going to filter it down to 2 pages of about 8 each, so about 16 labs. If I want to filter it further, I can say, well, this is definitely physics. I want this at, say, the college level, and I want it to be using the smart cart that I just showed. So I'll click on smart cart. And now when I hit filter with those additional filters, it's down to a more manageable list here. I'm going to show you one of these that shows you a variety of ways you can collect data with Capstone. It's called Impulsive Momentum. It's from our 550 physics experiment manual. Once I've filtered down to this, I'll click on the title of the lab, and it will bring me to that lab's entry in the experiment library. Now, you'll see a division here between student files and teacher files. And if you are not logged into our website, you will see no teacher files. It will just say log in to get the teacher files. You can create a free login on our website under my account here. And once you're logged in, it will give you access to these teacher files. Thanks, Jonathan. You put the link there in the through the experiment library directly. So let me show you a couple of the student files that are available here. There is a PDF. If I open that up in the browser, you will see that this is a fairly traditional lab, something you can print out or serve as a PDF to students electronically. And it's going to say, here's the lab, here's the equipment, here's the theory, and here are the steps. All right. So we've all done labs like this, kind of paper-centric labs. Now, We hope we did a good job writing this lab, but we may not have gotten it exactly like you like it or with exactly your equipment. So we also provide you whenever possible with an editable version of the student lab. And that's what this Word doc is. So this is the same document as the PDF. It's just editable, easily editable. Now, fairly unique to Capstone is we also have Capstone files for some of our experiment library labs, especially those for higher level. And if I download this particular file and open it in Capstone, so I'll close Capstone in the background since I can have only one open at a time, and I will open up the downloaded Impulse and Momentum Capstone file. And this is going to look quite different from Capstone, but it is in Capstone, and I'll show you why once it opens. This is what we call a Capstone Workbook. We've already learned the workbook is just that white space we can put things in. And so far we put in tables and graphs, but we can also add to the workbook images and text. And this text and images could be instructions. We can even add questions and places for students to respond to those questions. So here is the workbook for Impulse and Momentum. All right, instructions on page 1, and students would simply work through this. All right, no paper needed, and tells them how to set it up, calibrate, all this setup. And the real power here is that these are dynamic displays. So I can collect data directly in this workbook page alongside the instructions. I can use all the same tools. And there are even places for students to record responses to questions or record things like cart mass. So this is what we call a PASCO Capstone Workbook. And some of the labs in our experiment library, like this one, have the option of either of those two forms. All right. Right, so Jonathan has pasted the link there into the experiment library directly if you want to explore that afterwards. I will have that link in a set of resources as well. So quick question for you. If you've used PASCO Capstone before, what's the format of your experiments? Are you using lab documents, whether they're ones that you write or that you're getting from the PASCO website, or are you using electronic workbooks where all the instructions are there? And are you creating them yourself, or are you using some of PASCO? So let me open one final poll here so you can share your experiences. Appreciate that. And the question here is, tell us a little bit about your experiment formats. Do you primarily have students design their own labs from scratch? Or do you use lab documents published by PASCO, such as through the experiment library? Do you create your own lab documents that are paper-centric? Or do you use electronic workbooks that are self-contained within Capstone, either from PASCO or ones that you design yourself? Results are coming in. Thanks for that. Leave it open for about 10 more seconds. Great. So let me share those results with you. We have something of a tie here. Just under half use lab documents published by PASCO and half use your own lab documents. Right? And of course, there's a happy medium there. You could start with PASCOs and edit them. 14% of you have students design their own labs from scratch. It's a great learning tool when the opportunity arises. 14% of you use electronic workbooks within Capstone, and 5% of you use your own electronic workbooks. Fantastic. So benefits and challenges to each of those approaches. But take a look at the experiment library. Jonathan's put the link there. I'm going to pause here before we jump to our last activity to mention that if you're interested in getting a certificate that proves you attended and learned something today, you can do so by doing the following. If you registered and then either attend live or view the recording of this session, and then within the next few days, go to this session's content quiz. It's just a 3-question quiz. To pass, you have to get 2 of them. And it is at bit.ly/cs-quiz-22. Jonathan has kindly put that in there for those of you who are with us live in the chat. You can also point your phone at this QR code to get there directly. Just going to ask some questions about the content covered today. So we have one more activity that will cover some remaining content, but this quiz will be open through next Monday, February 7th, US Pacific time, and the certificates will be mailed out about a week from now, next week, Wednesday. Great. All right, one final demonstration. This uses very little equipment. I think it's a really neat lab though, and it'll allow us to dive into a few more things about Capstone. So here is the setup for our gas pressure and volume lab. It is going to use a wireless sensor, so we'll see how to connect to those. This is the wireless pressure sensor. All right, most of our wireless sensors are white. The smart cart, red or blue, is one exception there. And when we use a wireless sensor, it has a battery built in, and it has a Bluetooth radio that allows us to connect without the use of wires. Now, this sensor happens to come with a 60 milliliter syringe. I've already connected it and filled it with 30 milliliters of air at room pressure. So let us jump over to Capstone and quickly see how we can collect and analyze some data of pressure versus time. So new experiment in Capstone. I'm going to turn off my 550 because we don't need an interface for wireless sensors. And there are a couple ways to do this lab. I'm going to show you kind of an intermediate approach. The first thing we have to do is figure out how do we connect wireless sensors. To do this, I'm going to go to the hardware setup screen, and it's going to be searching for any wireless sensors that are on from PASCO. I'm going to turn on my wireless sensor by tapping its power button. And just to represent the real world, I'm going to turn on another wireless pressure sensor in this room that's a little bit further away to represent something that might happen in your lab that is having multiple sensors. So we need to figure out which of these two wireless sensors listed, or perhaps a longer list if you had a classroom full, which of these is my wireless sensor. So if I look at the list, I'll notice a couple things. One is that it's ordered, and it turns out that the one at the top of the list is the one that is presenting the strongest radio signal, which is almost certainly the one closest to your computer, unless you have very cramped quarters. The way to double check this, though, is to look at the ID, 6-digit ID that's on the sensor itself, and match it to the 6-digit ID shown here, and it happens to be this one, 345. So to connect to it, I will simply click on it in the list of available wireless devices, and Capstone's going to connect to it via Bluetooth. Its Bluetooth light is going to change from blinking red, meaning it's available, to green, meaning it's connected. And I could then proceed to connect another sensor if I wanted to, but I'll leave that other sensor for someone else. You can connect multiple wireless sensors to the same computer, but a given wireless sensor can only be connected to one computer at a time. So now that I've made that wireless sensor connection, I can mix wireless and non-wireless sensors if I wish, but this lab works with just this one sensor. I'm going to go over here to our setup options. And previously I showed you in the first activity, we could just click sensor data, but this lab requires a special technique. I need to record one pressure at 30 milliliters of volume. I need to record one other pressure at, say, 25. So in order to do that, I'm going to use a special technique. And this technique is accessed easily one of two ways. One way you'll notice is that it's such a popular lab, we have a dedicated file to it that shows up when we've connected the sensor. The other is more generic for this type of approach. Sensor data is actually a button with a drop down. And if you just click the button, it's going to be set up for continuously sampling. That's at a periodic rate. But I'm going to use this different technique called manual sampling. So I'm going to click sensor data's drop down and choose manual sampling. And it's going to create for me a table that has some data I can type in and the default measurement for the sensor that's connected, which is what I want here, pressure, and create a graph of pressure versus that measurement. Well, what measurement am I going to type in this lab? It is going to be the pressure, the volume that I read off of the syringe connected to my sensor. And I'm going to read it off in milliliters since that's how it's marked. So I'll give those units milliliters. I'm pretty much set up here. I have pressure versus volume. And the key here is that it is using a different technique for sampling. You'll recall I previously had a record button, but because I chose manual sampling in the configuration, it has changed the sampling mode to keep mode. You can see the word keep sample here. So the way keep mode works is I hit preview and it tells me what the current pressure is, but it does not record it because I need to make sure I'm at the right volume. And only when I know I'm ready do I tell Capstone to record the value from the sensor by hitting this keep check mark. So since I'm only one person here, let me quickly type in the volumes that I expect to use. I'm going to go down from a volume of 60 milliliters in the syringe down 5 milliliters at a time. And I could type this in later, but it's easier for me to do here since I have only two hands. And now I'm going to stretch the plunger out until I'm at the first volume of 60 milliliters. Notice that this is monitoring the volume here and indeed plotting it here. And only when I'm ready for it do I hit keep. Let's see what happens in the table. The kept value turns black from pressure and it forwards to the next one, 55. So I'm going to quickly go down here and go down to 55 milliliters, hit keep, go down to 50 milliliters, hit keep. And you notice it's plotting these points live on the graph each time that I keep it. So go down to 40, hit keep. By the way, a quicker way to do this is if you click inside the table, you can actually hit the enter or return key to keep as well. So I'm at 35. Let's say I make a mistake. I accidentally didn't go to 30. I can correct that as long as I haven't stopped by returning to that cell, going to the correct volume, and hitting keep again. All right, so see how quick this data collection is. Keep at 25, keep at 20, and now it's a little tougher. Go down to 15, keep. And this puzzles a lot of students. They say, hey, wait, why is there an 11th data point here? Well, it's in color, and the fact that it's in color means it hasn't been recorded. So as soon as I hit stop, I have just the 10 data points that I requested. All right, so that looks interesting. I could now challenge students to try to fit this. Excuse me. They may say, well, linear fit, that doesn't look so good. Let's compare perhaps inverse and inverse square. Which of these fits better? So here's inverse square. Here is inverse. And you can see visually, it definitely goes to inverse. You can also quantify that. The root mean squared error for inverse is 0.82, whereas for inverse square, it's 8.87 or 8.77. So I'm going to delete that. And we can see that the inverse fit seems to relate the pressure to volume quite nicely. We have just a few minutes here. Let me show you an extension of this. Some teaching approaches like modeling physics and some AP exams kind of have students linearize everything. It may be great that they can figure out inverse, but once they suspect it's inverse, some pedagogies have students create a straight line so that we're always using a linear fit. Let me show you how easy that is in Capstone. I'm going to open up my displays palette to the right and drag in a new graph below this existing graph. And for starters, I'm just going to replicate the graph you see above. So we still have pressure versus volume. Now, if we suspected this was an inverse relationship or had proof of it, like this fit, we could actually go in and we could make a calculated column that would take the inverse of the volume, and we could plot that. But that's such a popular thing to do in these approaches to learning science that we've dedicated a feature in Capstone's graph to it. If I want to take the inverse of the x-axis measurement, by the way, while I'm here, let me show you I can change units. So even though I recorded in milliliters and I never told Capstone how I convert from milliliters to liters, it knows that. So I can use the SI units if I want, even though it's convenient to type in milliliters. But I'll return to volume here. Normally I'd use this to change the measurement, but there's a feature embedded in the pop-ups for the axis measurements on graphs that lets me transform the data on that axis. So I could square it, cube it, take the square root. In this case, I want to take 1 over that, or x to the minus 1. And that is going to do a transformation in the graph alone that converts from volume to inverse volume. Right? So a really neat way to cycle through and just say, well, what if I squared it? Would that linearize things? A great way to quickly linearize things. And now, of course, I could turn on a linear fit if we were standardizing on that approach. And I fundamentally learn the same things, different units here. I could reconcile those like that. All right, so take a look at quick calcs embedded within the axes of graphs for a neat way to transform data and quickly linearize it. I'll save this file so I can share it with you later. And as I do that, I'll ask Jonathan if there are any other questions we should address before we wrap up with the resources.
Not at this time.
All right, so I'll save this as gas pressure and volume data. And I'll be sharing all of these Capstone files that I created during the session with you if you wish to do further analysis with them. All right, so we have 3 minutes left. Let me tell you a little bit about our upcoming spring webinars. I know some of you are in the Southern Hemisphere. Apologies for the Northern Hemisphere centric approach, but it sounds better than first half of the year. So coming up over the next few months, we have quite a few sessions. Some of these may be of interest to you. I'll leave the slide up for a moment, but I want to highlight for you, I saw questions going by. Is he going to cover video analysis? Are you going to do FFT? The answer is no, not today. But if you're interested in some more advanced PASCO Capstone features, please register to join me on May 4th, a few months from now. And you can register at bit.ly/PASCO webinars, which Jonathan has kindly put in the chat there. Register for any of these sessions. They are free, similar format to today. Some are 60 minutes, some are 90. But we look forward to seeing you at a future session. If you are interested in custom online training, you can email me at training@pasco.com. All right, how can you learn more? Well, a lot of resources for PASCO Capstone. I will be sharing this slide as a hyperlinked PDF. And the only thing you might want to record right now is the address shown in the box. I think Jonathan has kindly put that in the chat. bit.ly/GSCS for Get Started Capstone, 22 files. That will lead you to a Google Drive folder that will have this slide, other resources, and the files that I've created today. So resources for today are found there. Quickly speaking, Jonathan's very helpful online help is available directly within Capstone, or you can go to our website here. We have a lot of videos. Check out our YouTube channels, especially these two, our main YouTube channel that has lab experiments and product overviews, and our How Do I channel that tells you how to do some of the most obscure things in PASCO Capstone. We're on social media. You can get, as I said, to our future webinars here. Don't hesitate to contact our technical support group. They're in the same building as us here, and they are eager to help you out with things that are broken or just help figuring out. They're former teachers. They are eager to tell you how to do things, sharing their experience. And you're welcome to email Jonathan or me with your future questions as you learn to use Capstone. And if you want to get in touch with your local rep, whether in North America or outside anywhere in the world, you can go to pasco.com/support. All right, I'll come back to this slide later, but you do have it in the Google Drive folder. If you're interested in learning more about Capstone and practicing rather what you've learned today, you can go to that folder and download the Capstone challenge file. Page 1 will tell you some challenges of what to do using the techniques we learned today. And if page number 2 will allow you to get some data from a neat little experiment, freezing a temperature sensor in the freezer, and do some analysis of that data to extend and practice your skills. And with that, we'll formally end it. If you need to leave right now, I certainly appreciate your time. You can close Zoom webinar, and in your browser will pop open a very quick feedback survey. It's anonymous. We welcome your honest feedback. We study these to learn what we did right and what we can improve in the future. All right, but Jonathan and I are going to stick around a bit. I'll end the recording here, and we are eager to answer any questions that we didn't get to or any questions that you have thought of about Capstone, whether we covered it today or not. So we'll end the recording. We hope to see you at a future session, and we'll be sticking around for your further questions.